Hello there, and welcome to this video guide to Romeo and Juliet, looking today at Act 1, Scene 3. So, Act 1, Scene 3 kind of continues the theme of the first few scenes we've seen so far, in that it is establishing characters, setting up events for later on and themes for later on. We are introduced in this instance to the female characters, and we identify the relationship between them. It's interesting here that we get a window into an entirely female world. And Shakespeare seems to be trying to give some kind of authentic voice to the women of his play. What we do have to bear in mind, of course, is that this is still covered by the fact that Shakespeare himself is male and the actors playing the roles are male. But it is interesting that, certainly at least they were, during Shakespeare's time during the Elizabethan era, because women were not allowed on stage. But we still see an attempt to give a window into this female only world. It's a really interesting thing, because obviously if you look at modern versions, from the Zeffirelli version through to the Lerman version, the latest versions that you've seen, we see female actors playing the female roles. So when we see it, it kind of, you get a sense, okay, this is the window into the female world of Romeo and Juliet. But of course, it would have been men playing that, and it would have been a man writing that, trying to kind of give that experience at a remove. And yet he still does manage to provide some kind of an interesting dynamic here, which is different from the male characters. It's a different dynamic between them, but we do see some similar themes coming through. We see the nurse is bawdy. Her language is not the high poetic language of, say, Juliet, and she delivers these crude jokes in a very crude and sometimes not very knowing way. And we're invited as an audience to laugh along, but also to laugh at her. And we are also introduced, of course, to Juliet here. Again, it is interesting to note that we meet Romeo first. His name comes first in the title. But we do see events from Juliet's perspective as well. And it is intriguing to note that whilst Romeo is given about 20% of the lines of dialogue in the play, Juliet is given about 18% of them. So yes, she has fewer lines, but not that many fewer. She's not that far behind him. There is, whilst not quite equity, it's not far off. And again, you can almost view this as being, I suppose, almost progressive, that we have a character, and particularly we find out Juliet is a very young character as well, who delivers thoughtful, considered lines, high poetic language. She has soliloquies and scenes to herself. She takes very direct action at different times. Interestingly, we're still looking at a world which is very male-dominated. 31% of the total dialogue in the play is delivered by the female characters, which is, that's less than a third of the lines, delivered by a demographic which presumably make up around about 50% of the population. But there you go. So what you can take from that, though, is that whilst 18% of those, 31% of the lines are delivered by female characters, 18% of them are delivered by Juliet. That shows the kind of importance that she has. As a proportion of her gender, she delivers the bulk of those lines. Romeo doesn't have that kind of same proportionate status. But let's have a look at some of the lines here. So, Lady Capulet and the nurse and Juliet, their dynamic gets established fairly clearly and fairly early. Lady Capulet has to get the nurse to find her daughter. She doesn't know where her daughter is. And then we're introduced to the nurse making a kind of like saying, "Oh, I swear by my virginity at age 12." My God, what an odd thing to say. And we see her making these slightly ill-judged comments which just seem out of place given the context that we find her in. And then again, we see another development of this relationship here when Juliet replies, "Madam, I am here. What is your will?" This is a really, really formal response. And again, it's really made completely clear when the nurse is about to be dismissed, but Lady Capulet changes her mind because actually she's more comfortable talking to her daughter when the nurse is around, and really probably letting the nurse do most of the work in terms of building a relationship with her own daughter. She needs an interlocutor to be able to communicate and have a relationship with her own daughter, which is a kind of a very telling thing. Although a little bit later here, we find out maybe why. And then as we move through, they're talking about how old Juliet is. And the nurse, says, "Oh, I'd lay 14 in my teeth that I'd bet 14 in my teeth that she's 14 years old, but I've only got 4 teeth." So we've got a kind of cheap crack at the nurse as a member of the lower classes and having poor dental hygiene and perhaps being, a little bit old and gap-toothed. Cheap shot, but, here is Shakespeare playing to the masses. A little bit of an information there on the wetness, because here we find something out about the nurse and Juliet's relationship and what the nurse's role was. She would have been a wet nurse. She would have actually breastfed Juliet and brought Juliet up practically as her own child. Here we talk about the idea that it seems as though we learn that the nurse had a child of her own who died. Infant mortality rates in Elizabethan England are incredibly high, regardless of your wealth and status. Infant mortality rates are considerably higher than they are in the world at large today. And here we learn about this and that. We clearly see the nurse is a substitute mother for Juliet, and Juliet views her as such, and the nurse views her as a substitute daughter. And you see this in several different instances. And we see the nurse doing a typical motherly thing, narrating a baby story. However, she's doing this in a kind of completely inappropriate fashion. She's talking about when she was weaning Juliet off breastfeeding. And I don't imagine either Juliet or her mother, who did not do this, feel entirely comfortable discussing this particular topic. And then she even goes on and tells a story, and there's a kind of a sexual joke in this story that when Juliet was she was a toddler, she fell forward, banged her head, and her husband said, "Oh, when you're older, you'll fall backwards. You'll be on your back. You'll be on your back." It's women, particularly noble women, your job is to go onto your backs and make children for the next generation of rich and powerful. And making a joke like that at the kind of an expense of a toddler seems just doesn't seem appropriate. But perhaps actually more than just the reference there, but there's maybe a kind of a point about the fate of young girls from noble families was essentially to be married off, often to much older males. And those bargains might have been struck when the child was a toddler. They would have said, right, your destiny is going to be when you're old enough to be married, you will be married to this person. And there's almost a hint of that in this kind of anecdote. Lady Capulet just doesn't want to hear the nurse's burblings, but it's interesting that she isn't able to stop the nurse. And the nurse again kind of chooses this very comic language. She talks about the bump on Juliet's head being the size of a cockerel's testicle, which is just why choose that as your simile? Again, it's this, we're meant to laugh at the nurse and her crudeness and her lack of awareness of what is and isn't appropriate. And she comes back to this slightly inappropriate joke. Again, we get it. It's just icky considering that he's making this joke at the expense of a toddler, which just doesn't seem right. As the dialogue moves on, it is interesting that Juliet says, "Stint thou too, I pray thee, nurse, I say I." So when Juliet says, "Stop," the nurse goes, "Peace I have done." The nurse seems to be more inclined to do what Juliet says than she is to do what Lady Capulet says. So it's interesting here that we see that dynamic is a little bit different, that Juliet's relationship with the nurse is closer, and she's more capable of getting the nurse to do things than her mother is. What else also interesting here is that we see the nurse expressing the idea that she wanted to see Juliet married. She wanted to live long enough to see her married, see her happy, see her settled. And that's an interesting thing, because that is much more of a parental concern, given the times, given the context, than perhaps a professional one. So we can clearly see there's a much closer bond going on. And Lady Capulet is saying, have you thought about marriage? What do you think about being married? And Juliet goes, well, I hadn't even thought of it. Juliet, as we've already discovered, isn't yet 14. And to us, this entire discussion just seems inappropriate and not okay. She's 13 years old. Okay, give or take, she'll be 14 in a couple of weeks. But marriage at that age, at that time, particularly amongst noble families, as I've said in previous videos, wouldn't have been unusual. It wouldn't have been uniform. It wouldn't have been absolutely the way it happened in every instance, but it certainly wouldn't have been unusual. The idea of being betrothed and being a parent at the age of 13 seems less than ideal to a modern Western audience watching this. However, as I've said in previous videos, and I'll reiterate the point, the age at which you were forced to go into the adult world in Shakespeare's time was very different to the age that occurs here. And now, often because lifespans are shorter, at the age of 13, you might be a third of the way through your life. It's not unreasonable to expect to live to the age of 80 or 90 these days. So 30 puts you in that same position proportionately within your own lifespan. Whereas if you are only going to make it into your mid-40s, late 30s, early 40s at best, then you've got to think how much time is available to you. And also, the idea is that you might have a marriage that occurs, but that marriage would be arranged, organized, the betrothal would be long, and eventually it wouldn't be until Juliet was 16, which is exactly what her father says in the previous scene, that the actual ceremony takes place, and she would then leave to go and become the wife proper of her betrothed. However, we learn something else here. Lady Capulet says, there are younger than you here who are married and are already mothers. So it's made clear to us that this is a world where girls of Juliet's age are being used in this way. They are being used to marry and to cement political alliances and to carry on families. They have a particular role in society, which objectifies them essentially for their, for the biological purpose of carrying children. To a modern audience, again, this strikes us as unusual. It's uncomfortable for us, but this was the way of the world at the time. We also learn, I was your mother much upon these years. I was your mother when I wasn't much older than you. Lady Capulet was a mother when she was more or less Juliet's age. So again, that comes back to this, and we get to get the sense from the dialogue, and you can probably see in various versions of the play that Lord Capulet is quite a lot older than Lady Capulet. And Lady Capulet may not be, or may not have been, the first Lady Capulet. Juliet is certainly not the first child. And if you add in the fact that if Lady Capulet had given birth to Juliet round about Juliet's age, it's highly unlikely that she'd given birth to several other children. And Capulet talks about the earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she. So presumably he's had other children from other marriages. And again, if we think about sort of the history of uh, the nobility in England at the time, if you think about Queen Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, and well, he went through a plethora of wives and had a plethora of children, most of whom aren't alive, as witnessed by the fact that Queen Elizabeth is on the throne. So this is kind of replicating, to an extent, the uh, the setup of the current royal institution, and it wouldn't have just been unique specifically to the king. This would have been the case with powerful families throughout England and throughout Europe. So whilst we as an audience are kind of recoiling from this and constantly getting hit by these what kind of strike us as moral surprises, and we're taken aback by this and think, like, that's terrible. This was what was happening. And then we learn about Paris, the valiant Paris, who seeks you for his love. And it is interesting that she uses this term, that she seeks you for his love. She does use that word. She doesn't just say wife. Again, perhaps this is to appeal to Juliet's sense of romance. Perhaps it is because she genuinely feels that Paris would be actually quite caring, quite loving to Juliet. And in various versions of the play, you see Paris as, at worst, harmless, and most of the time, actually, seems to be quite a nice guy. But, you could also play him as someone who is heartlessly looking to make a political connection. There are two ways you could go with that character, I imagine. Most people seem to go with, here you've got someone who's at worst, he's harmless. Interestingly, the nurse calls him a man of wax. Now, this could just be a malapropism where she just chooses a really unusual description. But what does a man of wax mean? Is it that he's like a carved character? He's perfect. His skin is pale. His features are carved like a statue in wax. But if you're going to describe someone as a statue, you would probably talk about being a bronze or a marble figure. He's a man of bronze or a man of marble. Again, that gives qualities of strength and solidity as well, whereas wax is malleable and soft. Is she suggesting that, oh, brilliant, why, he's a man of wax? You'll be able to mold him to whatever you want, Juliet. Here we have someone where you can take the power. And if we think about what's going on here, because the Lady Capulet in the next sequence is really interested in saying, look at his face, learn to love him, see what's behind his eyes. And the reason here is because you shall share in all that he doth possess by having him, making yourself no less. That uses the possessive pronoun. You will have him. You make yourself no less. By doing this, you become rich and powerful by marrying someone rich and powerful and using your feminine influence to gain power and rank and status. Because actually, that's the only avenue open to Juliet. She can't inherit, or at least the circumstances would have to be extraordinary for her to inherit. It's possible that Lord Capulet might do that, but if there are male descendants of direct and of lineage, the chances are that things would default to them. Women were extremely restricted in what they could and could not do in Elizabethan society. And here we see Lady Capulet kind of expressing this and saying, like, if you should have power, you can use this. And we see a kind of a female world where if you're going to move in the realms of power, it has to be through the proxy of your husband, and you need to exert influence. And we actually saw Lady Capulet doing that at the start of the play, if you recall, Act 1, Scene 1, when, she's saying, well, why are you going out there with a sword? You need a crutch rather than a sword. And she's stopping Capulet for going out. And Lady Montague doing the same thing, you shall not you'll stir not one foot to seek a foe. Here you've got powerful women controlling, to an extent, their husbands. And during this course, the nurse can't help but make a crude joke about, oh, no, hey, yo, you don't want to make yourself less. No, you'll be bigger. Women grow by men. There's clearly a direct kind of sexual reference and a reference to pregnancy. And yes, ultimately that is true, that it would be the idea that she would have children. And Juliet is quite passive here. She's not desperate to engage in husband hunting. Hardly surprising. She's a 14-year-old. But it's interesting that she is not actively engaging in this, which also shows that she hasn't been actively encouraged to think about this. Why is that? Is this because Lord Capulet doesn't want his daughter too soon early made, as he mentions in Act 1, Scene 2? And he's been protecting her from this kind of vicious political sphere where young women are married off for political gain and financial status. So there we go. Again, on the way out of this scene, the nurse can't help herself. They're about to go off to the party. She's about to be introduced to Count Paris, and the nurse can't help it. She goes back to seek happy nights, work out for yourself what she's referring to there about stuff that happens at night between men and women. What is also interesting, though, to notice is that we follow the Juliet, the county stays, go girls, seek happy nights to happy days. We see much of this play is written in verse. And what's interesting about patterns is they're really significant when they change. But verse can show you things. Often students will say, oh, what does it mean when Shakespeare is rhyming? Well, there's no one thing. It means a range of different things. You've got to look at who is rhyming, what words are rhyming, when and how are they rhyming, what's the structure of the rhyme. But here, this idea of sharing lines, I think, shows that Lady Capulet and the nurse both want the same thing, which is that Juliet needs to marry. So they're both kind of, possibly for different reasons, possibly for very similar reasons, that marriage is the key to Juliet's security in her future. They are both now sharing rhymes because their thought patterns have fallen into lockstep with one another. So there you go. A nice short sequence, but there's a lot of things in there if you really look for them. Some subtle things hidden behind the lines. I mean, we're introduced to the nurse and Juliet and Lady Capulet, and we find out about their dynamic here. We learn a bit more about Paris. But what we do see is the setup for some of the sort of subsequent conflicts that are going to emerge. This kind of conflict between Juliet's desire not to marry Paris and ultimately Juliet's family's desire to have her marry Paris at some point. And literally there's a conflict between Romeo and Paris stored up through these events into Act 5, Scene 3. We also see the nature of the mother-daughter relationship and the nature of these relationships in these noble families kind of exposed, that distance between the parents and the children that has emerged. And we see a continuation of the motif of contrasts here through characters, with the quiet and thoughtful Juliet and the bawdy and garrulous nurse being played out. So there you have it, Act 1, Scene 3, a seemingly fairly innocuous scene, but with a lot of things in there to look at, particularly with regards to the context. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this was of some help. Bye-bye now.